evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this meeting of the Upper Branch of the British Computer Society. Before we start, I should have the pleasure of allowing Chris to present some certificates of appreciation to some of our committee members. These certificates are usually issued to people who have been doing lots of good things for a long time or good things for a short time. So first we have one for Severus. Seb, can you come up?
Thank you very much.
Marcus, right, there you go. This evening we have the BCS President, Chris Rees, up from London to give us a talk about the ethics of IT AI. So I'm not going to say anything more about Chris because he's had a very long, illustrious career in IT. Leave it to Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Just to avoid embarrassment, you may want to switch your phone ringer off. So, what I'm going to talk about, first of all, some definitions, so we are agreed what we're talking about. Focus on the BCS's mission, which, as everybody knows, is to make IT good for society, and what's the relationship of that to ethics. Pose the question, when should we think about ethics when we're developing or using IT? Look at the obstacles to ethical action and what to do about that. That's the first part of the talk, and then in the second part I'm going to look more specifically at the ethics of AI, and I'll give a little more detail on that when I get there, and then try and draw some conclusions. If what I say is objectionable, controversial, whatever, do feel free to interrupt or ask questions, or at the end, whichever. So, some definitions. Wait a minute, it's gone wrong. That's there already. If you look up ethics in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's defined in terms of moral principles, and then if you look up morality, it's defined in terms of ethics, which is a bit circular. So there's actually more in relation to morality, relating to the human character or behavior considered as good or bad, the distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, in relation to our actions, desires, and the character of responsible human beings. So I think we all know probably what that means, and most of us are ethical naturally all the time. I found about 70 definitions of ethical. I don't suggest you look them all up. But I rather like this one from 1893. Ethics is the study of what is right or ought to be, assuming that whatever we judge to be good, as we implicitly judge to be something which we ought to bring into existence. So if it's good, we should do it, and if it isn't good, we shouldn't. And that seems reasonable. So how does that relate to making IT good for society? Well, I suggest that you can't make IT good for society unless you act ethically. Unethical IT can never be good for society. And there are those who pursue it very skillfully. Unethical IT. So when should we consider whether what we're about to do is ethical or unethical? I propose that the answer is when we conceive of a system or app, when we specify it, design it, develop it, test it, or implement it, or use it. and that includes selecting data sets and training AI. So at every stage, you may want to ask yourself, is this ethical? And it's certainly easier if the ethical risks are identified as early as possible, because grafting ethical IT on later is as difficult as grafting anything else later. So just as we have an objective of privacy by design in GPDR, so I suggest it should be ethical by design. So start at the beginning. Make sure what you're going to be doing is ethical. Is that easy? Well, most people, I'm sure everybody here, is ethical and wants to act ethically, but not all. And in many cases, what you're doing, there will be no ethical issue, and that's fine. You know, if you're writing a payroll, to use a rather out-of-date analogy perhaps, just got to work. It's not an ethical issue. But if there is an ethical issue, if when you reflect that what you're about to do is maybe a bit borderline, a bit iffy, then there can be significant obstacles to acting. For instance, the desire to conform, not to step out of line. Everybody else does it. It's what everybody does. The desire to conform is strong. You may need to make your budget, achieve your target, deliver against a deadline. There are commercial pressures on all of us in whatever walk of life. Certainly in industry, but it's true in academia and so on. Maybe you're at the bottom of the pile, just joined, don't have any credibility yet, and what you're being asked to do it doesn't feel right. A little story. I was teaching on a course in New York on business ethics, and we ran a little case study, and everybody on the team was, quote, new on the project, just joined, and at the end of the month when they came to submit their expense claims, the project manager said, by the way, just pad your expenses a bit, $25 here and $25 there. And the natural reaction is that's wrong. And he said, if you don't do it, everybody else will be found out. You've got to conform. So the question was, what do you do? And we asked them to think about that, come up in groups and come up with answers. And they did, and there were a variety of answers. Go to HR, put in a padded claim, but tell somebody you're doing it. And some people just said, go along with it. A variety of answers, as you'd expect. And then one young lady said, I'm living this. She was finance controller for a beauty products company based in New York, headquartered in Los Angeles. And she noticed that that's what was going on. They were putting in post-it notes as receipts and obviously inflated expense claims. So she went to her boss, who was the CFO, and said, look, this is what's going on. And he didn't want to know. So she stepped back and compiled two sets of books. One was the actual books, and the other was the books that they would have been if people hadn't been doing this. And then after about 6 months, she flew out to LA and went to see the head of HR and presented the data. And she said, I'll pick this up and take it to the board. So what she'd done was careful, honest, properly prepared. She got the evidence. And so we said, so what's the outcome? She said, I don't know. If I get fired, I'll find another job, but I've done nothing wrong. and it's up to the board. And you could have heard a pin drop in that audience. So if you are confronted by an ethical issue in your role, there's always a way to handle it. Even if refusing may put your career on the line, and it may. So what should you do? And this would be my recommendation. The first thing is to fall still, actually, because if you're confronting a question like this, all sorts of ideas will arise in the mind, and it may be confusing and difficult. So you need to take a couple of minutes just to get the mind still, and then ask yourself this question: is what I'm about to do completely ethical? And if the answer is no, you need to fall still again, and then ask yourself, well, what should I do? And there won't be a standard answer. It'll be different in every case. But the experience is that the answer, or answers, there may be more than one approach, may well arise together with the strength to act on them. My business partner and I wrote a book about 10 years ago called From Principles to Profit. And this was the idea, that if you act according to the highest principles, you'll eventually, not necessarily in the short term, make a profit. And we wrote to a number of our friends and colleagues and clients and said, this is our proposition. Do you have any evidence in your own experience that either supports or the other way? And we got a number of responses. People who had been in this kind of situation, been asked to do something which they didn't think was right and had refused, and a number of them had lost their jobs, even quite senior people. But they all said, I never regretted it. You may need help and guidance, and we're looking into whether we can help as BCS, perhaps with a code of ethics and guidance, methods training. Early days, don't know quite what we're going to come out with, if anything, but we do recognise the issue. And I think it's an issue which certainly transcends the BCS. It's an issue for the industry. Thanks. I mean, the recent Facebook scandal is particularly obvious. And I think we're at sort of a bit of a tipping point as to whether the tech industry is going to be seen as honest or to be feared. And we can act from wherever. You don't have to be a captain of industry to be able to put this sort of thing into action. So, that's IT in general. Let's now have a look at the ethics of AI. A few more definitions. Then I want to look at the main issues which generally arise in AI: bias, particularly bias in the data that the AI systems are trained on, issues of transparency and explainability. It's an unpleasant word, but I haven't seen a better one, and the House of Lords used it, so I'm okay. The confusion between correlation and causation, which is not an AI-specific issue, but it's one which gets particular headlines in AI. Look at harmlessness, because AI can be used for negative, destructive purposes. The issue of liability, which is an ethical as well as a political and societal issue. And then the big one, which is sharing the benefits fairly and mitigating the negative effects. So where are we? I would say that AI is already superhuman, and it can clearly beat the best at chess and Go and other games, as everybody knows. But other applications too: speech transcription, lip reading, detecting deception from posture, and forging voices, handwriting, video. It's particularly good at video. And this is real intelligence, but non-human. But importantly, we're talking about narrow, not general AI. The notion of general AI, that you have a machine which can replicate anything that a human can do. There are those who say it's at least 20 or 30 years off. My guess is it's far longer off than that, and I question whether we'll ever get there. I may be wrong, so don't rely on me. It's just that there are just so many obstacles to realizing that I don't think that's worth worrying about. I do think it's worth worrying about a number of the issues that we confront right now using deep learning and other AI techniques. So, bias is a well-known, not always well understood characteristic. And bias is defined as an expectation derived from experience of regularities, things which continually go on in the world. A stereotype is a bias based on regularities we don't wish to persist. So a stereotype is automatically bad. And prejudice is acting on stereotypes. For instance, bias is knowing what a programmer means, including that most of them are male. Apologies to the ladies in the room, it's a fact. Most programmers are men. Stereotype is knowing that most programmers are male. And prejudice is hiring only male programmers. It's not good. We need far more women in IT. But that's where we're at. And it's useful to recognize there are these biases, and I'll say more.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Okay to interrupt?
Yeah.
I would strongly disagree with that assessment.
Great, go on.
So, we heavily evolved to utilize and develop stereotypes in interactions with. We heavily evolved to develop, recognize stereotypes and utilize that in our interactions. It's a very effective way of doing efficient interaction based on only very little observations. Much of the research that I do in AI tries to emulate that type of reasoning because it's a very effective type of initial reasoning that can then be augmented with additional data as we interact. So I, for example, have data collected that allows me to extract 10 different prototypes of behaviors that I could recognize. Then I do something like Bayesian inference over that. And that very quickly allows me to interact reasonably effectively with you based only on a very small set of initial observations. And I would not agree at all that that's necessarily negative. Negative is just a social connotation because usually we use the word in a negative context. But typing is not necessarily a negative activity at all.
Arguing with the proposition that a stereotype is a negative concept.
Yes, I would say that.
Okay.
So to give you an example, say you're a robot and you see me for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how will you interact with me? You would most likely try to use social norms and various types of conceptual information, and you would try to model my behavior. But modeling my behavior from scratch is a very expensive process and requires a lot of data and observations. So because you do this from scratch. Typing is a way of accelerating that process massively by creating profiles from data that you can very quickly access when you interact with robots. So I may already know, for example, if I play chess with you, that there is a certain number of stereotypical strategies that I can observe here. And so if I observe just a few moves that you might make initially, I can match that with my known types. And then I can use that to plan into the future very effectively. And even if those types don't entirely correspond to your behavior, I can enrich them later on with new data that I observe. So the difference is that I can very quickly adapt to your playing style, for example, if we play chess, as opposed to trying to model you from scratch with data that is really expensive to collect.
Okay, but you're talking about typing. The conventional understanding of the word stereotype, I suggest, is different.
Yes, that's what I say. It's because there's a social connotation here.
Yeah.
But if you just say that if we have these types and using these types is negative, then I would disagree.
I'm not saying all typing is negative, but if if we use the word stereotype, as you say, it has social connotations, but those are real.
Yeah, well, are we talking about AI systems here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. That's certainly a useful contribution. Thank you. Some interesting examples of bias in the data. This young lady, I'm not sure I can pronounce her name, Joy Bulamwini. She's a very capable individual. She's a Rhodes Scholar. She's been at Harvard, and she's currently at the MIT Media Lab. And as you can see, she's a radical. She is a lady of strong political views, and good luck to her. And she found that, and she's an AI researcher, and she found that the facial recognition software wouldn't recognize her as a human being. And in some cases, black women are identified as monkeys, which is clearly offensive. And she found that it wouldn't actually recognize her as a human being until she put a white mask on, which she's holding in her right hand. And so she's done some very interesting, and published some very interesting research. So this bias, interestingly, and it's the bias of white males, which I will demonstrate, white males being more recognizable than black females. And it has history, as I point out there. The white balance feature of digital cameras was designed and made for white people by white people. And they could have done something different, but that's what they did. And curiously, that's still true. If you buy a digital camera, that's the way it's built. So she produced a data set of carefully curated faces and asked the system to identify the gender, and it got a pretty well, almost 100% right with so-called lighter-skinned males, white men. 7% of white women were misidentified, so 93% accuracy. 12% of darker-skinned men, and 35% of darker-skinned females were misidentified as men instead of women. So clearly there's bias in the data set. Yes, sir?
Is this actual bias, or is that this more difficult to process?
Well, I haven't read the full paper, but that's the assertion, and it seems to be widely accepted that it's a function of bias in the data set, or in the AI system. It could be either. So why is there bias in AI? The answer is we have biases and we have stereotypes. So the programmer's a male is an example. So the data sets contain these biases, and it's not surprising, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some biases can be accurate, reflect the real world. And to bear out your point, stereotypes are culturally determined. It might be different in China or Australia. You may disagree with the last statement, that there's no algorithmic way to discriminate stereotype from bias. Would you? Do you say that's true or false?
Well, to distinguish between stereotype and bias in data?
Yes.
Well, we first have to talk about how we represent these things, and
okay.
There may be some ways to do this.
My authority of this is a, I can't think of the name. Yeah, she's a lecturer at the University of Bath. I'll find her name afterwards, but this is not my judgment. I'm relying on authority here. So, there's three kinds of bias we can identify: accidental, implicit, and deliberate. The accidental bias really derives from the fact that the designers and developers are too homogeneous, not sufficiently diverse. implicit bias is because the data sets on which the AI is trained are biased, and that's a big risk. And the third, deliberate bias, perhaps less common, but we've got some examples, are where it's introduced intentionally into the development process. Here's a deliberate bias. That's a stop sign which machine learning trained on a standard database recognizes as 45-mile-an-hour speed limit rather than stop. And there are other examples, including a right turn, which, as I said, might be useful if you live on a rat run. Maybe we need an offence of creating a sign with intent to deceive a self-driving car. So how do we address this? Starting point is bias is inevitable because we're biased. And therefore we should address it in the same way as we address our own biases. Recognize it, where appropriate compensate for it, and eliminate prejudice biases. So implicit bias you can compensate for or counter at the design and architecture stage. Accidental bias also, but if you diversify the workforce and then test and iterate and improve, then you've got a better chance of doing so. And deliberate bias, you need some external inspection process and audit, regulation, and we've got lots of experience of auditing systems. We need to develop it for auditing AI systems. An AI system, as you may have read in the press, recently cracked the German Enigma code in 13 minutes, compared to the thousands and thousands of hours that they took in 1941-42. And that was a gimmick. It was a clever gimmick. It was a good gimmick. But of course, the AI system didn't know, to use an anthropomorphic term, what it had done or how it had done it. More significant, the designers didn't know how it had done it. They knew in general terms, but they couldn't explain how it had got there. Classic example of the black box problem. It works, it produces an answer, we don't know how it works. And neural networks have that characteristic, and the more stages of the neural network you have, the less easy it is to determine how it reached its conclusions. In some cases, that doesn't matter very much, and in other cases, it matters a hell of a lot. And so it's a common characteristic of deep learning systems based on neural networks. IBM and other major companies, IBM has taken the lead on this, have argued that black box systems which cannot explain themselves should not be marketed at all. That's a fairly extreme position, but it's an interesting proposition and worth debating. And maybe we should be distinguishing between safety critical or life critical or financially critical systems and others. So if you apply for a mortgage and the mortgage company turns you down and you ask why, and they say, we can't explain because the AI system decided that you were not a good bet. Well, then you'd want to know, well, if I earn more money, would I be a better bet? If I lived in a different part of town, would I be a better bet? And so on. So what are the characteristics of my application which have caused you to turn it down? If they can't explain, they can't answer that question. And that matters. Similarly, if you have a medical diagnosis system and it's pretty successful, but it can't explain how it gets there, that matters. Of course, you have to modulate this to some extent in that a lot of these systems, at the moment at least, are decision support systems rather than decision systems. And while that's true, the finance officer or the clinician can decide what he's going to do with the information provided. But in quite a number of cases already, AI systems are making decisions with no human intervention whatsoever. And it's a high risk. If you do determine that black box systems are not to be marketed, that may limit what we can do with AI. And it's also true that some human decisions are impenetrable or illogical. You might say the government is making quite a few at the moment. I probably shouldn't make political statements. And there are those who argue, why should we impose higher standards on AI than we do on human beings? It's a debate. I don't think there are any conclusive answers at this stage. And if we can generate some debate this evening or
Well,
go.
because you can take a human to court and you can't take AI to court.
That's a very good point. There are those who have proposed that AIs should be corporate persons. I think that would be a completely terrible idea. And I'll come back to that when we talk about liability. But you're right. These are machines, no more nor less. Yes, madam.
Is this from the thing about AI as being a corporate person? Is this from the angle of AIs and artificial intelligences shouldn't eventually have some sort of rights, or is this from the angle of from a liability perspective only?
I don't know, because I haven't had that debate with anybody individually. I think more the latter than the former. I can't see why they should have any rights at all, but I may be wrong. Go on.
If you're creating something, especially when you start to develop more general purpose intelligences, you are creating things that are effectively, they're intelligent thinking in the way that we understand thinking. Even a chicken has a basic amount of rights and how it should be treated. Why should we not extend that to something simply because it's silicon and artificial and not something not sort of like evolved from biological processes?
It's a point of view. If you make machines corporate persons, a lot of people will rapidly invent, acquire, build such machines, give them land, property, and hide behind it. So that's one very good reason why I would not allow that, because yes, you can sue a company, you can sue a person, but the company ultimately is the people. It's the shareholders or the directors or some combination thereof. But if you're suing a machine, I don't think that arises. It's an interesting debate. Somebody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you, as stated, you said corporate person, and I think the sense in which a corporation is deemed to be a person is in relation solely to liability and not, as I understand it, to rights of the
Any lawyers in the room? Are you a lawyer, sir?
I'm not.
No, nor am I. We need a lawyer. I don't know.
It was
I
raised
don't
as a
know.
perfectly valid wider question.
I'll ask my son, he's a corporate lawyer. Yes.
I think there is, as a parallel to the corporation being ultimately the people, I think there's a parallel to be made there also that an AI, or any system for that matter, more or less intelligent, is also the result of human processes. So it's creators, its owners, and there is like legal work in establishing the chain of responsibility that leads to the AI's action.
Can we come back to that when we talk about autonomous vehicles, because that's where it's the most obvious key issue. But yeah. Okay. Intelligibility. I didn't know if you're aware, the House of Lords has just published, about a week ago, a very good report on AI. It's House of Lords paper number 100. You can find it on the parliament.uk website. I recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff in it, and we contributed some evidence to it. And they identified domains requiring intelligibility in a general term. You need to understand what's going on, the corollary of the black box syndrome. And they listed these: judicial and legal affairs, some financial products and services like personal loans and insurance, We just discussed that. Definitely autonomous vehicles and weapons systems. And they distinguished, I think very usefully, between technical transparency and this rather ugly but meaningful word, explainability. So technical transparency might include access to the source code, and a lot of AI systems are open source anyway. The trouble is it doesn't really get you very far. Certainly only useful to the expert, not the layman. The regulators perhaps, but I doubt it. Regulators are not usually as au fait with the technology as we are. And even so, looking at the source may well not help you to understand how a decision was reached by the machine. Explainability is the situation where AI is developed so that it can explain the information and logic it used to reach a decision. And a lot of systems at the moment cannot meet that criterion.
The House of Lords look at the computer-generated artistic works, because the same issues are there for the copyright. Who owns the copyright of a machine-written symphony, say, or a machine painting? And it's the same two issues, really, the technical transparency of how it was done, which may show you that the tune is heavily dependent on Paul McCartney or Mozart, in which case perhaps they would have applied for the royalties. And then the explainability, you might find that the owners of the intellectual property right creating the machine-generated work don't want to reveal that intellectual property.
Right,
But it's
interesting.
interesting that they've only focused on the kind of business, I suppose, aspects, and perhaps not on the artistic.
Sure. I think it's more than business. I think what they're talking about is wider than business. It would include the medical domain, for instance. Their concern, and it's one that I would echo, is that if a machine is making a decision and you cannot determine how it made it, first of all, you can't tell whether it was right or wrong. Well, you may not be able to. In some cases you can independently, but in many cases you can't. And secondly, you don't, as I suggested earlier, you don't know what you would have to do to enable it to reach a different conclusion. But your point is a very interesting one. And yes, I don't think they did discuss the artistic. In the GDPR, everybody familiar with GDPR? You can't not be. So Article 22 contains a right to an explanation provision, which was considered by most experts as reasonably vague and contains a number of limitations and doesn't apply if a decision is based on explicit consent, if it does not produce a legal outcome of similar significant effect on the data subject, or if the process is only semi-automated. The data protection bill currently going through Parliament goes further, and that seems good. And Dr. Sandra Wachter, who is an expert on GDPR, in her testimony to the House of Lords, said, "It's proposed that after a decision has been made, the individual has to be informed about the outcome, which is new and better than what the GPDR currently offers." Sorry. It also states, that this is the bill, that data subjects should have the right to ask that the decision be reconsidered or that the decision not be made by an algorithm. Both those things meet and exceed what is currently envisaged in the GDPR. So it's helpful. But
How else would you make a decision without an algorithm?
It may not be implemented by a machine, but at some point, if you're going to make a decision, even if it's just, I'm going to flip this coin, you are using an algorithm of some description. It's impossible to avoid, by definition.
I don't think that's true. I mean, do I do I want eggs for breakfast? I don't need to flip a coin. I can make a decision. Yes, I'll have eggs for breakfast.
But when you're asked to explain that decision, it will have to be, well, I felt about this hungry and I had enough time to make the eggs.
Sure.
So
Sure.
you have used an algorithm. You may not
You're
have
using-
thought about what algorithm you've used, but you've used an algorithm.
I think you're, with respect, so you're stretching the word algorithm.
I think I would refer to that as a behavioral pattern, human interaction. You can
Yes.
make a decision based on that.
Yeah.
So,
So
an algorithm, no.
I don't, it's not the conventionally understood use of the term algorithm. I mean, maybe in the limit you're right, but I think we know what we're talking about.
But surely if you've not used an algorithm, how are you going to satisfy the explanation? And they say, so how did you come to that conclusion?
Well,
Like,
Intuition.
Well, I can use, it may be just intuition or it may be taste. I mean, there's all sorts of answers to the question, clearly, depending on the circumstance. But, you know, if I decide, you know, you're going to get a raise or you're not going to get a raise as your boss, you can say, well, how did you make that decision? And I say, well, you know, you didn't do a very good job last week, or, you know, you're at the top of your salary band, or, I mean, I can justify it. I wouldn't think that most people would regard that as an algorithmic decision-making process. It's just observation of the facts of the case.
I think maybe this is a slightly different point of view.
Okay, I respect your point of view. So, I mean, you know, if you've ever been in a court of law, the judge will give his judgment after hearing all the evidence and taking account of legal precedent, and he will write a judgment. He has, by law, to write a judgment. And he lays out his facts and his logic and how he reaches his conclusion. And it's all done in the mind. There's no use of machinery in that process apart from typing. And it's a beautiful process. A well-argued judgment is very well worth reading. So,
Can we say that in practice this will imply that a user has the option of asking?
can't quite hear, sorry, can you speak up?
Can we say that in practice this will entail that the user has the option of requiring a human to revise a decision made by an AI system?
That seems to be what they're proposing, yes, if I understand it correctly. And that's, you know, it's not law yet, it's just going through as a bill, not an act. So maybe amended, or like most bills going through the House, may get bumped by Brexit because there's no bandwidth to do anything else. But there we go. Okay. Next issue is correlation and causation. Now this is not an AI-specific issue at all. Correlation does not imply causation, but may seem to. It's an old problem in statistics, very well understood. Nice graph here of US spending on science, space and technology correlated with suicides by hanging, strangulation and suffocation. And you may surmise that although these look highly correlated, they're probably not causally related. In other words, if spending on science goes up, we would not necessarily expect more strangulations, suicides by strangulation. It's just a coincidence. And the more data you look at, the more likely you are to find unreasonable but attractive looking correlations, and they're not causal. And it's a very important question, is this correlation causal or not? And you know, the tabloids love jumping on correlations and deciding that they're causal.
I think if I read that graph, I don't see it's the increase in spending on science and technology that increases suicides. I think suicides are actually starting to level off. So we just have to not reduce the amount that's being spent.
Okay. Well, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the suicides that... Now, statisticians have tests to detect the problem. Generally speaking, AI systems don't. And so we need somehow to ensure that when an apparent correlation comes up, we can determine whether it's causal or not. So the problem isn't unique to AI, it's not new, but it seems to be exacerbated by AI because they have huge data sets to be trained on, and in huge data sets you'll find correlations. Next topic I've called harmlessness. So, like all technology, machine learning, AI, robotics are ethically neutral. They're just machines. Maybe soft or hard, doesn't matter. And by the same token, they're dual use. They can be used for good and ill, and they are used for both. There are major risks of malicious use. Again, there's a very good report, if you're interested, you haven't found it, called The Malicious Use of AI. If you Google that, you'll find it. It's the result of a symposium held at Oxford about a year ago, maybe two, by a very good group from a wide variety of sources, British, American, continental, and this is the synthesis of their work. They identified lots of potential types of malicious use, spear phishing, which is very expensive. You have to spend a lot of time researching the individual you're trying to corrupt or phish, whereas an AI system could do it much more cheaply because that's a characteristic. Hacking, impersonation, poisoning of the data of the AI systems, so AI systems can be attacked by other AI systems, use of drones, political influence, obviously, we've just seen. So they summarize the types of threat as expansion of existing threats, because they're more cost effective and you can mount them, you're just getting a multiplier effect, introduction of new kinds of threat, and the change in character of threats, for instance, as I've said, the AIs attacking AIs. They're all obviously unethical. That doesn't need arguing. What the report proposes is that we need to think hard about this and come up with measures to develop defenses and countermeasures. For instance, the risk of an automated vehicle being hacked is a very serious one. And it's actually a real risk because the level of quality of software in cars is nowhere near as good as it is in aircraft. And yet there are far more people killed by cars than there are in aircraft. But we just, when an aircraft falls out the sky, it's big news. When a car crashes, it's not. So it's our cultural response to events that is fashioning this. But it's serious, and it's not, sadly, it's not that difficult to hack cars. And once they're automated, you could get all kinds of mess.
Sorry.
Please.
So are really all of them obviously unethical?
What?
I think you could reconsider some of these. Use of drones. You didn't say.
I'm not saying all use of drones is unethical. No, sorry.
It says they're all obviously unethical. Or hacking, is that obviously unethical? What if it's, for example, some threat entity that we're trying to hack into to build up a defense?
I plead PowerPoint in my defense. Yes, my words are too abbreviated, and I take your point entirely. I'm not saying use of drones is unethical. I'm saying that use of drones for malicious purposes, for instance, a mass of drones attacking, which could be a non-state actor or a state actor, attacking civilians, I would say that's A, malicious, and B, unethical. Use of drones for crop spraying, of course it's not. Yeah, so I'm being too brief. Point taken. I'll edit this for the next presentation. Thank you. Second aspect is lethal autonomous weapon systems, or laws. And they pose particular ethical challenges, such as, can we really trust them to discriminate between combatants and civilians? How will we know whether they're doing what a human operator would do? Already the use of drones controlled by an Air Force colonel buried deep in Kansas or Missouri, they experience the same kind of moral pressures as a pilot in a real aircraft. But you're taking that right out of this situation. There's no human operator involved, and so you could have some pretty unpleasant effects. Should they be banned, like chemical and biological weapons? There's an International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which is chaired by a professor at Sheffield, whose name will come back to me in a minute. Thank you, Dal Sharkey, who argue and have submitted evidence and submissions to the United Nations, arguing that they should indeed be treated in the same way as chemical and biological weapons, banned. And there's another organisation, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And you can find their arguments on their websites. Having said that, all the major powers, yes, go on.
I think that is the key point with artificial intelligence. The intelligence is artificial and it has no ability to apply the human common sense, whatever that is, to actually check itself. It is really difficult, I would suggest, for any algorithm, program, to be smart enough to realise it's making a mistake. And I don't think we'd ever get that far.
I agree with you entirely. And that's part of the reason why I would argue that general AI is a really long way off. Because the AI systems we have are really quite effective in their limited domains, in some cases extremely effective. But they don't know what they're doing, whereas we do.
Most of them
We have some idea. But,
the key point you made earlier about being asked to explain a decision the machine is asked. If it was a truly intelligent machine and it was reacting in the feedback loop to things going on around it, it may not give back the same answer if it was asked multiple times. Is that truly intelligent or is that just wrong? If it can't explain itself.
I'm not sure the definition of the term really, but I think it's the case that AI systems can indeed learn and improve as they observe, and they can take feedback and act on it. They can do that. Whether you would regard that as truly intelligent is a semantic point.
But if you got a different answer out, if you think of an underwriting system for life insurance, and somebody was declined and they went back and asked again, and they couldn't explain why because they came up with a different answer, that wouldn't be a good place to be.
Right? Fair comment. So,
it seems that we already have largely autonomous weapons now. It's just largely they're weapons that fight other weapons. So anytime you've got a really expensive...
Can you give an example?
Yeah. When you've got something expensive like a ship or a tank, you tend to find fairly autonomous systems being attached to it. So the Israelis have counter-missile equipment on their tanks that launch the projectile close in. The Americans, since the 80s, have had great big guns on their ships for attacking incoming missiles. So there's a human sitting in the box that's being attacked right now, but those are permissive systems. There's already limited inhibitory systems in some of the robots that are used for defending against IEDs. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's some really sophisticated language going to be needed to define some of this stuff, since nobody's going to want to give up their expensive shooting technology. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing governments do.
Yes, it does seem like you're going to have some difficulty writing something that doesn't make a cruise missile, for instance, look like an autonomous weapon system.
I think you're probably right.
It is designed to evade radar, evade defences, go to a place and do a thing. That sounds pretty autonomous. It's not just travelling under gravity or anything.
Yeah, I don't know enough about cruise missiles to answer the point, but I take your point. I think it would be very difficult. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. as I suggest, non-state actors may well be developing them too, and one has to ask the question, would a ban work? And your argument is probably not. Yeah, I'm not sure that there is the international consensus to, because everybody is developing them because the other guys are developing them. Okay, liability. I said we would discuss the earlier points here. So autonomous vehicles, I don't think will be on the road until, for consumers, I mean they're on the road in test right now, but until the liability issues, and many others, have been resolved. So when an accident occurs which is the fault of an AV, who is liable? And I suggest it's not the AV because it's not a corporate person. Is it the driver, if there is one? If you have level 5, you may know there's different levels of AV, and level 5 is the fully autonomous one. So there wouldn't be a driver. There might be somebody sitting in the front, but he's reading the newspaper. Is it the owner, the company that sold it, the manufacturer, the designer of the AV, or the failing component, if there is one, such as the AI control system? What if the AI has been hacked? What if the owners fail to install the updates? I mean, just installing updates is a huge practical problem, but let's assume it's going to have to happen, it must happen, approximately the same frequency with which Microsoft updates Windows, I presume, but not in the same fashion. And the owner hasn't done it, so I mean, it's a very thorny problem.
Would that be installing a new driver?
Yeah, you better. Ooh! Very good, very good. And so, you know, if the allocation of responsibility were unfair, it would be unethical, and it would also be unacceptable, I think, in society. So, as I said at the top, I think this is a legal question, a legal issue for sure. It's a societal issue, and it's an ethical issue, and it's a really difficult one. And I'm not aware of serious efforts to engage the industry, the public, the manufacturers, the AI scientists, all of whom need to contribute to this conversation. So I'm sure others would wish to be involved. Any comment?
There is a body of research being done at the moment, I think mainly in Israel, where they are looking at what happens when that vehicle has to make a decision about who it's going to kill, whether it's the passengers or the people in front.
Oh yeah, the trolley problem.
Yeah, exactly. And who's going to end up in the worst position? And they discovered a lot of it was very much based on societal norms of the country the vehicle was in. So there's this aspect of, as soon as it drives across the border, it flicks a switch internally and goes, now you've got less chance.
Fascinating. I didn't know about that. There are those, is everybody familiar with the trolley problem? Yeah. There are those, Professor Floridi at Oxford says, forget the trolley problem, it's irrelevant. I don't think that's true. It's certainly not new. I mean, Thomas Aquinas was discussing the trolley problem before they had AI in the 14th century. Sorry? Trolleys and railway trolleys. Indeed, but I mean, it's exactly the same issue as...
Sorry, but a question here, what's the trolley problem?
Oh, I see, not everybody knew what the trolley. You've got a runaway trolley, which is on rails, and it's careering down the hill, and there are no brakes, but there's points, and you can flip the points. So it either goes this way and kills a child, or it goes that way and kills 5 adults. And what are you going to do? Okay, so that's the trolley problem. Well-rehearsed problem, and it's exactly the same problem as, you know, you've got a woman in childbirth, and either the mother or the child is going to die, and which do you do? And that's a tough decision. It's a real question, and it does happen. And generally, in our society, it's the mother that survives. That's the conventional ethic, one might say. But it's the same question. So it's not a new issue. But one of the problems which has been pointed out in relation to the trolley problem is that most people would say, well, the answer should be you slam the brakes on, right? Because unlike the railway trolley, an AI-driven car, an autonomous vehicle, has brakes. So you slam the brakes on. Now, think of the consequences of that. If you know that that's what they're all programmed to do, you just step out in front and they slam their brakes on. Which means that you can bully automatic vehicles. Or, the car in front can slam its brakes on and then you're forced to slam the brakes on. So there are a lot of very big practical as well as ethical, legal problems, I believe, which haven't yet been solved before we're going to get AVs on the road, apart from we haven't built them. Madam?
By that token, you can bully drivers in sort of a low speed limit area
You can.
by stepping out in front of them.
Yeah.
So, where's the difference?
Well, the only difference is you're taking more risk if you do that with a real driver because they've got thinking time before they hit the brake, whereas an AV doesn't. So you're right. I haven't seen many people doing it.
You've always never crossed Princess Street.
No, I'm a Londoner, I have to confess. So, yes, sir, the back.
That scenario works if every EV is using the same algorithm.
Yes.
But if one manufacturer decides not to implement brakes because it saves money.
Yeah, well, you'd be taking a bigger risk even in Princess Street. Sure. If you're interested in these issues, is anyone familiar with the Gresham College lectures? Okay, one or two are. You should be Londoners, you see. There's a wonderful institution in London called Gresham College, which was created in the 17th century by Sir Thomas Gresham, whose son had predeceased him, and he was unbelievably rich. And he left his money to a college which would give lectures for the public free. And it survives very much to this day. Again, you can Google it, and all the lectures are video streamed and recorded, and you can download the lecture and you can download the PDF. And they're generally very high quality indeed. And the Worshipful Company of Information Technologies has sponsored a series of lectures by Martin Thomas, Professor Martin Thomas, thank you. How would I ever give a lecture without you here? And there's one he's done on automated vehicles, and he identifies some of the major problems, a few of which I've mentioned, like updating the software and the trolley problem and so on.
There was quite a lengthy article in the IEEE Spectrum magazine a few months ago. And one in particular I remember is that lots of people who've got AVs are going to the theatre and they can't park, so they send the car driving around until the show's over. And they all do that, and then the roads are closed up.
There's an analogous problem, which isn't AI-driven, I don't think, but if you use Waze, then the driving app, then it knows when there's a lot of traffic on a particular route and will reroute you. And some towns in New Jersey have got so fed up when the I-95 is clogged and Waze is rerouting drivers through their village, and they can't get out of the drive, literally. People couldn't get out of the drive in order to go to work in the morning. And so when they realize that this is happening, they're blocking everybody who doesn't live in the town from driving through it, which of course is likely to provoke the next town to do the same. But it's entirely a function of Waze. Never used to happen. There's probably AI in Waze, I don't know. How are we doing for time? Okay.
Just on the liability issue, presumably the big issue is who will insure against those liabilities, because you can imagine contracts all the way down the line with 100 pages of terms and conditions, which would lay off each of those things to the person further down. So you reach the conclusion that every autonomous vehicle will become an autonomous limited company owned by the owner of the car, and then that company will have a degree of insurance, but would just go bust if they ever had to
Which would be an unsatisfactory situation if reached.
Except it would then be for the government to say you must have £1 million worth of liability insurance or something like that. But you can imagine that it would actually be the AV or the company that owns the AV that becomes liable, because everybody else would have laid off each of those liabilities.
You know the ginger beer case?
Yeah, I was hearing that in the radio.
Yeah. Others know the ginger beer case? About 1890, I think, before Lord Acton, if I recall. A young woman went to a tea house and ordered a ginger beer, and the ginger beer had a snail in it, and she fell ill, and she sued the cafe, and I can't remember exactly how it worked, but eventually the manufacturer was joined in the action, and the judge held that the liability was for the manufacturer, not the cafe, although they said, nothing to do with us, you didn't have a contract with us, which of course is true, and he relied on the biblical statement, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. And who is your neighbour? Well, it's anybody who might be harmed by your action. It was a landmark decision, a major landmark decision, and the basis of all product liability law ever since. And the two remarkable things about it were that he relied on the Bible and not English legal precedent, and he defined liability in this sense, so that the manufacturer who carelessly allowed the snail into the bottle was liable to the young lady. Not quite sure how we got there, but yes. So if the owner of the car could show that the manufacturer had screwed up, you'd have a chain of lawsuits. So I don't think it's a simple question.
I find your second last sentence on that slide you've just moved on from interesting. I think we're closer to codifying the meaning of unethical, at least for certain narrow legal purposes, than we are to codifying the meaning of unfair. So I find it curious that you're kind of defining unethical there by referring to unfair.
If I use the word unjust, would that make it any different?
Don't know, I'll have to think about it.
Okay. I think fairness and justice are probably equated in most people's minds. Unfair is a rather informal word.
It's very contextual, as I see it.
Yes, I mean, if you accuse your child or grandchild of doing something wrong and they didn't do it, it's unfair. Actually, what they're saying is it's unjust. So you're contravening justice, and justice is a legal concept as well as an ethical one. It's a fascinating discussion. We can go on, maybe afterwards. It is likely that a few people will get very rich and a lot of people will get very poor as a result of the implementation of AI. So it'll have, everybody seems to agree that it'll have a material impact on employment as machines perform human functions faster, cheaper, better than humans. And this isn't a new phenomenon, we've seen it many times before, and most people instance the Industrial Revolution when machines were first introduced for physical tasks, now we're introducing them for mental tasks. So we got over it then, where's the beef? Well, and we in the industry tend to argue that it'll create new, skilled, well-paid jobs, and it will. But there were several recessions and massive unemployment as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So that isn't quite as good a precedent as it's made out to be. In the long term, there will be new, well-paid, better jobs, no question. But in the short term, there can be massive dislocation. And the new jobs and new job functions will arise, for sure, but will they suit those put out of work? And, you know, this is happening all the time. You know, how many punch card operators have you met lately? They were there when I was a lad. One or two in the audience. But, so, you know, people are put out of work by the development of technology in its broadest sense. But this can be much more radical because much wider impact. That's the problem. I mean, it's worth saying that, you know, Donald Trump is promising that coal and steel will come back to the Rust Belt of the United States. Well, A, he's lying, and B, it wasn't China. Mostly it wasn't China. Okay, China exports a lot of steel, but it wasn't really China that put them out of work. It was automation. Not necessarily AI, just automation. So, you know, it's going on. An important point to note, we always assume that new job functions that are created by technology will be there for people to do, but they might be more effectively done by the machines themselves. What are the solutions? There are those who argue for a universal income. Everybody should have a slug of money from the government and then they don't have to worry. Well, that's certainly another lecture, debate, discussion. I'm very sceptical. Others advocate it. There are a lot of problems with it. How is it going to be funded? We need people to have money in order to spend money in order to keep the economy going, for sure. But there's more to work than money. It's a source of self-respect and function in society and self-worth. So I don't think that the universal income concept meets any of those criteria, even if you could orchestrate it so that it worked, and nobody's proved that. There are experiments going on. I think the key is retraining. And that might be done by companies. For instance, AT&T recognized some years ago that the implementation of new technology would mean that a large number of their engineers would not be needed because the systems were so much more efficient and so on. And so they very carefully and consciously introduced a training scheme which the individual had to spend his own time at, although I think the company paid for the actual training, so they could acquire new skills to replace the ones that were being displaced. That, I think, is a very good example, and they're not the only ones. It's particularly one I'm aware of. So it's obviously easier for large corporates than small, and they won't be the only ones affected. So companies may be able to do it. Colleges of further education and other educational institutes could, and in some cases are, setting up courses so people displaced, or even not yet displaced, but might be concerned about it, can learn skills like user interface design, which at the moment AIs couldn't handle, need people, and it's not a skill which requires huge technical background. And there are lots of examples like that. Yeah.
I think there are examples of the government could provide tax breaks for companies for investing in training schemes, like they do with investing in physical assets.
Yes, they could. Hopefully with less bureaucracy than they have with the apprentice scheme. But yes.
A lot of politics in that. In Scotland, for instance, the colleges of further education are being run down in order that Scottish domiciled students don't pay fees at university. That's where the money's coming from. So there's a lot of politics in that.
For sure.
And part-time study at universities moving drastically. even two brains just realising every second level how it works.
Okay.
You know?
No,
So there's
fair
huge
point.
politics in
There's lots of problems all over the place. I take your point entirely. Who's going to fund it? Well, we said it could be the state through tax breaks or other ways, individuals, companies, and so on. There's an interesting parallel. When the bridges were being built over the Thames, as each bridge was built, and this was over a 20, 30-year period, they put the bargemen who were the ferrymen who were ferrying people from one side of the river to the other out of work. You know, who needs a ferryman if you've got a bridge? What the bridge builders did was to give the ferrymen who were put out of work a piece of money. It didn't give them a career, but at least it got them over the hump. The concept is a good one. To conclude, I argue that if IT is to be good for society, it must be ethical. Sir?
What about the creation of standards, rules and regulations so that the quality of systems is maintained and improved all the time? In the aircraft industry, whenever if an aircraft has a crash or something, then there's an accident investigation board which was started with the railways when they came into being in the early 1800s. And after every incident, there's an accident board which then give recommendations.
Yes.
Change engines so that now
I'm struggling to see what...
The rail industry and flying is probably the two safest forms of travel.
Forgive me, I'm not quite understanding what you're... I accept the examples, so what? What's the point? What are you suggesting?
If it was applied in this context, then the associated root cause analysis, as well as doing good in itself, might give us a way of more appropriately attributing liability, for example.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the only snag I see with that is that aircraft crashes are fairly rare. Car crashes are sadly rather common. So you might need an awful lot of experts doing it, but conceptually, sure. Good point.
They're rare because standards have been put in place over the years and improved.
Yes, sure. And the standards for in the aircraft industry are much higher than they are in the car industry. Yes. Very, very good point. And as I said, the same applies to software. Standards are much higher. Yeah. So.
About retraining, there is a concern that some classes of people may be left completely unemployable even in the long term, even if you try to retrain them. So
there is such a... Go on.
So that is one of the arguments of the proponents of universal income, because the proponents say maybe some people will be impossible to employ, so we need to give them some money.
Yes, I mean, there is an argument. I wasn't opining. I was saying I think there are big challenges around universal income, but I chose not to make it a major issue because it's such a big issue. But yes, there may be those who need a safety net. There are. I mean, we have safety nets now without a universal income. As a double.
If I may pile up on that, I would go a bit further. I would say, if we assume the premise that eventually AI will match human beings in all ways, what will be left for humans to do that will be more cost-effective than automation? Right? And if we look at it, nothing is the answer, right? So it's just everything else that is not productive, like hanging out, talking to other humans. So I guess the idea that everybody could be employed by being, I don't know, personal looks consultant or something is doesn't follow the scrutiny. So I agree completely that universal basic income is far from the ultimate answer. But I do think that thinking along these lines is probably an investment in the future. Eventually we'll have to come up with a way of sharing the riches that we are producing automatically, and not just concentrating them as is happening right now.
Sure. The only point I would differ with you is on your premise. As I said before, I think that universal general AI, I don't think we'll ever get there. Now, there are a lot of fine men and women who are much smarter than I am who think I'm wrong. I think there are some really good reasons why that's unattainable. Thank God.
I think that's a dangerous assumption.
It's not an assumption, it's a belief.
If you made asked people in 1880 when we had powered flight, they'd probably not said 23 years. If you'd have asked people shortly before the steam revolution at the start of the 1800s, when will the first 10,000 miles of railway be built, I don't think anyone would have said, oh, we'll get that built in 30 years. Humans have proved incredibly good at dealing with tough problems, and we're only getting better at it. And every improvement we make in AI and in computer science feeds into making AI and computer science stronger. So, everybody's been predicting things like death and Moore's law for 20 years. It'll die eventually, but
still going. Yeah.
So it's really, we're getting to the point where we may just be able to brute force something even if we don't fully understand how we've done it. We just throw enough computing power at it and big enough matrices and enough smart people figure out clever little hacks involving vectors, and before you know it.
I was wondering, I'd like to hear your reasons for, you said you have good reasons for believing that AI will not be as intelligent as some people believe, for example, surpassing human intelligence in all ways imaginable. Can you share some of your good reasons?
Okay, I'll try. What is consciousness? I would suggest that consciousness is fundamental to humanity, not only, animals have consciousness too and so on, and it's not in the mind, and it's not in the brain, and therefore it's hard to model, and that's an understatement.
So am I correctly understanding that you don't believe that we are just physical entities?
Certainly.
Okay, well then I understand where you're coming from. Then there's probably not much there is to say to convince you.
Probably not, but feel free to try. No, are we just physical? Goodness me, no.
Yes, to me we are.
Really?
Our intelligence and everything we do and ours encoded in how we are physically represented.
Dualism doesn't hold up to any sort of decent scrutiny. Because
Dualism,
yes. The idea that
body and mind is separation.
That your mind is in any way separate from the physical processes that go on inside your head. Because if there was something which were going on that weren't determined by the physical processes, and there's no way to investigate it, then how is it acting on the physical world to allow our decisions to become made real? If it can act on the physical world, it's perceivable within the physical world, and therefore it has to be some part of physical reality. However, we've probably
we've definitely moved away from AI and into philosophy, and that's fine by me.
Wandering back towards AI. We don't need necessarily to, we've been talking in absolutes, so can we be as smart as humans? So these problems, let's say hypothetically it takes 30 years for GAI to come. Let's say it's long enough we're all dead.
Right, fine.
And I'm sure we'll all be comforted by that. These problems come up.
Well, I will be, I don't know about you.
Well, we don't have to solve the problem. Sorry, these problems come up, I think, fascinating. Going with the US, since it's the biggest industrial economy going for now, they list transportation as the biggest single job category people have. And I think we're within 5 years of vast numbers of those people having either no or very limited jobs, because we'll be able to load up a big truck with a Google or a Tesla brain in it, have it do the vast majority of the drive to the next town, potentially overnight, whatever, and then either deliver to its final destination or think like a rail hub for major towns. So, delivery drivers are only doing the last 3 miles. At which stage we're going to start to see, and driving I'm doing as an intellectual job, because I think obviously I can get away with saying that is, which means that we're going to have a huge swathe of former intellectual workers going to the scrap heap soon. And things are going to fall through. It's already, I wouldn't want to be a young lawyer, because so much of the discovery work that used to be the donkey work that you did on the way up is vastly accelerated by AI, and that's the most categorical intellectual work going. Watson's working towards being the best GP that there's ever been. So we don't need to eliminate a category of people entirely, to just take a huge swathe of them and say, we keep 10% of you and they're massively accelerated. What do we do with the other 90%, since image consultants only go so far? Like, you dress well, like, I'm not naked and I call that a win. But this is, it is something that we're going to have to deal with as a boiling the kettle thing, and quite soon, I think.
I agree. No, I don't have any issue with what you're saying. We don't have to predicate general AI in order to identify that there's some very real societal problems coming up quite soon. I think that my personal view is that the advent of automated or almost automated vehicles that you're describing, even trucks, is a little further off from that. But, if it's 10 or 15 years, so what? That's still tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think there's actually a lot of problems to solve, but it'll come, and there's so much investment and public expectation and government expectation, it'll drive it. So it's just sure. Now I think there's a big problem there. I completely agree.
Yeah, I did state my argument on it. I think the crux for me is that it's a capital expenditure rather than operating expenditure. So you buy a truck, fuel is now electricity, basically zero. People, however, you have to keep paying unpredictably, which means that the robot only needs to be 10% as good as the person, maybe. Something in that low end before absolutely these are problems that we need to be publicising.
Yeah.
The general public probably don't want to be surprised by this. They tend to set things on fire with that.
No, I agree. I know it's a very real issue. So
I was wondering if you could share your opinion on this. So early on in your presentation, and that struck with me, you said the design should be ethical throughout from bottom to top, so as we develop our AI systems. But I think it's quite easy to think of examples where there's a tension here. So, for example, in the US, in Texas, we were developing AI technologies that would enable autonomous teams of robots to play soccer. Okay, no one would think that's unethical. It's a fun thing to do. It's really cool. You can create some really impressive results. Then we prepared a very large grant proposal for the US Air Force that was about coordinating autonomous swarm drones to kill enemies. And so here we had a really large discussion. So we could use most of the technology that we developed for robot teams, where no one would say that's unethical, and could apply them more or less directly to this new technology for the Air Force. So clearly there's a tension here. I didn't anticipate that used originally, but it's clear that many of these technologies can be used in that different context. And so it's not really clear to just say that the design should be ethical from the ground up. And that, in that sense, by transitivity, I shouldn't have developed these things initially. And so where... Well,
not necessarily. I mean, it's a very interesting example. And yes, I think we'd all agree with your premise that football robots is completely ethical or non-ethical. I mean, who cares? But then you can apply that technology to arguably unethical ends. And that's true of many other situations too, but, short of AI. The ability to write software to run a payroll or computer graph or something can also be applied in weapon systems and so on. So it isn't a new problem. And and you can't say, well, don't develop something because it could be misused. These are dual-use technologies. But at the point where you put your bid in to the Air Force for the drone swarm, well, maybe you should ask a question. So I'm not saying it's unethical, I'm saying you should ask yourself a question.
It didn't actually get funded in the end.
Oh!
But I'm wondering, how does that factor back into your recommendation when you say, think about the ethics of the technology that you develop, and if you find that there's a tension, don't do it. So if I think beyond my immediate application and then come up with a new application that is potentially repugnant to the public, or something like drones, then how does that factor back into my current technology?
Well, you can't uninvent something that's been invented. I mean, it's like the atom bomb, it's the same argument. So, but your second proposal was distinct from your first, wasn't it?
What I'm saying, you say, when you develop a technology, think if it's ethical. And if I'm doing this process, I could say, well, I'm using this to do robot gaming, and that's fun. But also then I think further, and I think, well, I could actually use the same technology to kill people, okay? I can use the same reasoning processes and implement them elsewhere, but it's the same research. And I would contribute to creating that research in the first place. And then it's unethical again. And so there's a tension here in that advice I find. How would you resolve that?
I don't think there's a general answer to your question. I think at each step or at each project, you ask the same question again. So, and you may be using technology which you have previously developed for some innocent purpose, but there isn't a general answer. There's never a general answer.
So would you agree that's perhaps a little bit too simplistic to say, just think if it's ethical?
What else can you do?
Well,
what's the alternative?
Well, I don't know. That's why I'm wondering what your advice is.
Well, I'm sorry, I stand by what I said before. At the point where you were submitting that bid to the Air Force, you could have asked yourself that question. And I don't know what answer you would give.
Sorry, I think you're missing what I'm saying.
No, I don't think I am.
Even without considering that second proposal, that was just an example.
Right.
Okay? Even if you eliminate that second proposal, as I'm doing the first original research, I can already think beyond that research and say, well, potentially this could be used for something bad. And so even forget about the second proposal of the Air Force, I can just think about these potential uses in my mind. And then I could come up with the conclusion that it could be unethical. So I shouldn't develop, even for this robot project, these things.
I have an answer for you there, which is, it is not the technology that you're developing, it is the use case to which you are proposing to put it. The prime example that comes out of actually TNT, which won a Nobel Peace Prize because it saved lives. TNT, that well-known explosive, saved lives, and it saved lives in the mining industry because it was far safer than nitroglycerin, which was the primary explosive use at that point. It saved it in railway construction and things like that. So just because the technology that you are developing can be effectively weaponized doesn't mean that the technology itself is unethical. People can come along at a later point and put that to an unethical use. But a knife is a tool. It's not necessarily something for killing someone or doing damage to them. It is a tool, and it's a purpose to which you utilize that tool that is ethical or unethical.
Couldn't have put it better myself. No, thank you. I think that's exactly right. Knife's a lovely example. You use it for cutting bread or stabbing people. And we do.
I'm Glasgow fan of all that.
Splendid.
There ends the argument.
I don't think I need to run through that list. I think we can see it and we've covered it. I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you for your really excellent discussion and strong points, for tripping me up where appropriate. And, thank you. Thank you for listening.
I'm not going to open the floor up to questions because we've had lots. If you want to call Chris and berate him in private, please do. We do have a tradition in the branch that we give our speakers a bottle of water. Water to help them on their travels.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. Much appreciated. That's my favourite kind of water.
Our next event is start of July. It'll be a joint event with BCS Women in Scotland. Not quite sure what's about yet, there's something in their minds, but it will be happening. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you again.